All right, so guys, we are doing a little tiny 1-week series that we are starting tonight. If you have been with us, you know that we've been in the book of Samuel for a long time, but we ended that last week. And so tonight, we're going to talk about a new topic. And the theme for tonight, you can see it up there, is going to be Start Sharp. And we're going to talk about, as we go into preparing for the new year, what are going to be some ways that we can prepare our heart for what God wants to do in us and through us in the new year. And even as we were singing just a minute ago, it reminded me of an experience that I had last week. So last week, I got a chance to go to a conference. And honestly, overall, the conference was really good. But when I first got there, it was hard for me a little bit because I had a lot of things on my mind that I was thinking about besides the conference. And we were mingling and meeting a bunch of people, and a lot of people were kind of older and had been in ministry for a long time. And so we were hearing some of the things that they were going through and stuff. But we stood up to sing our first song, and I just found in myself that I didn't want to sing. And I looked around and kind of saw how other people were dealing with it, and I noticed not really many of them wanted to sing either. And I was thinking about why was that, and I think that honestly it's because we're at a time in the year where people are just stressed. And do you guys feel that? Do you feel just like maybe you're tired, you're stressed, you're a little bit wore out, and this is a time of year you just want to kind of cuddle up with Netflix and a blanket and just chill, right? And I was feeling that, but I was also feeling that because I think that sometimes, especially, in any job, but in ministry, something I've learned is sometimes ministry can just be heavy and can be hard. And I think it's almost like how we get calluses on our hand or something. And if you eventually get a callus when you're working out because you don't want to keep getting hurt, right? But I was thinking about how sometimes when we go through hard stuff or discouraging things for a long time, sometimes it's like we can develop a callus on our heart, right? And it's a way of protecting ourselves, a way of keeping us from getting hurt. But over time, it can actually keep us from connecting with God, keep us from doing what God really wants. And so when I was at the conference, I admittedly, I wasn't feeling like singing or anything like that. But what kind of stirred up in me is I told myself, I said, Austin, I don't want to just be a crusty old guy that gets good at doing church stuff. I want to be someone who truly loves Jesus and who allows him to move my heart, right? And who feels deeply about things and who loves people deeply and hurts deeply when things don't go right, but who has a passion and a fire. And I was thinking that I didn't get into ministry just to preach sermons or lead events or do things like this. I got into ministry because when I was your age, God got a hold of my heart in a real way. And he honestly changed my whole life. And what I want for you guys is I want you to experience that. And I want you to see that he's the best thing that could ever happen to you. And so tonight, my prayer, honestly, is that we would get a sense of desperation back, that we would get our passion back, our joy back, right? That we wouldn't just keep going through the motions and just do Sundays because we do Sundays, right? But we would get our fire back for what God wants to do. And so to begin with, though, one of the questions I think we need to ask is, if we feel like we need to get the fire back, how did we actually lose it? What actually happened along the way? And to kind of answer that question or illustrate it, I want to tell you a quick story about two lumberjacks. Okay, lumberjacks are not common, but here's a story about them. All right, so there were two lumberjacks, and one of them, he was kind of an older lumberjack. He'd been a lumberjack for a long time, and he was old, so he didn't do a lot of wood cutting, but he was very wise from all his years, right? And then there was another one, and he was young, and he was buff, and he was ripped, and he was hungry. So he decided that he was going to challenge the older lumberjack to a wood cutting or tree cutting competition. And so he comes up and he says, "Hey, sir, I'd like to challenge you to a little tree cutting competition." And the guy's like, "Listen, man, I'm too old to do anything like that." And he's like, "Come on, are you scared or something? Prove it. If you're so great, come out here and prove it." So he challenges him. The guy says, "All right." And so they get to chopping. The goal is who can chop down the most trees in one day. And so the young guy, he's like, I'm gonna dominate this guy, right? So he gets his axe and he just begins swinging, right? Chopping them. And he just looking and the trees are just falling down. And he's like, I'm gonna crush this old man, right? And every time he looks over at the old man, he just sees him sitting down and he's playing with his axe or something. And he's like, what in the world? This guy's sitting down while I'm over here putting in work. I'm gonna dominate. Well, anyway, they keep going. They go through the whole day, and then they meet together to see how many trees they chopped at the end of the day. Turns out the young man, he only chopped about 20 trees, okay? But the old man, he chopped 40 trees. And the guy's like, how in the world is that possible? Because the whole time I saw myself doing all this work and you were sitting down. It looked like you weren't doing anything. And the old man says, see, that's what you missed. He said, when you thought that I was doing nothing, what I was actually doing was sharpening my axe. And he says, you ran out of energy and weren't very efficient because you never took time to sharpen your axe. And what we see in this story is we see that the young man, he used more and more energy and effort because his axe was dull. But the wisdom of the older guy is what brought him success. And there's actually a Bible verse that talks exactly about this. It's in Ecclesiastes 10:10, and this is kind of the theme for tonight. It says that if the axe is dull and one does not sharpen its edge, then one must exert more strength. However, the advantage of wisdom is that it brings success. And so what I want us to do as we're going into the new year is I want us to talk about, have you lost your edge? Have you lost your edge? Have you lost the thing that makes you sharp? Some ways you might answer that question is maybe in your speech, right? Maybe like everything right now in your life is negative. Someone asks you, hey, how you doing? And you're like, busy, tired. Maybe you're just critical about everything. You kind of complain about everything. Or maybe it's in your mind. Maybe what's in your mind right now is just like fearful. I wonder if everything's going to fall apart or things not going to work out like I wanted. I'm frustrated with things. I'm doubting things. I'm don't even know why I'm doing this. Why do I even try? Maybe it's things like boundaries. You know, you started out with this heart where I want to pursue God. I want to be pure and do all these kind of things, but I got kind of tired of doing all that kind of stuff. And now over time, it's just like I'll allow a lot of stuff in my life, right? I'll do things that I'm not proud of. I'll stop kind of saying no to temptation. I'll develop some bad habits. It's all different ways of saying that we've gotten dull, right? That we've lost our edge. And what I want to tell you is that if you live long enough, at some point, every single person in their life is going to feel like that. Every person in their life is going to feel like, I've gotten dull, right? And a lot of times it happens to us because we're discouraged, right? But also it's even because we've just been working a lot, right? Some of you just been putting in a lot of work, and over time, it gets tiring and you get dulled. And what I love is that God doesn't criticize us for being dull, right? But he does give us a solution to that problem that we're going to talk about. A few other ways that you can recognize dullness in yourself is, I think a lot of times for me, I've noticed, it's when I become apathetic or stop caring about things that I used to care deeply about. Okay, so some examples of that is like if I ask you like, hey guys, do you want to see Jesus like transform your city this year in this school? Like, do you want to reach to high school for the gospel this year? And you were just like, maybe, I guess, sure, right? It doesn't even fire you up anymore. Or if I'm like, hey, this year, do you want to like get plugged in with community? Do you want to have vulnerable conversations? Do you want to go deep in your walk with Jesus? And you're like, maybe, I think I'm supposed to, but not really. And what happens is when we get dull, we no longer even care about the things that we used to care about. Maybe even, we were talking about the band earlier. Maybe the first time that you found out that you were in the band, you were like fired up and you were like practicing all your songs like a week in advance, and you were so grateful just for the opportunity to be on the band. But then you're in the band for a whole year and you see your name in Planning Center and you're like, man, I wish I didn't have to do that, right? Because over time, what happens is we become dull. We become apathetic to things that we used to really care about. And now what happens is when you get dull, that anything that sounds like work, anything that sounds like more energy, we don't want to do it anymore. All right, we just feel like we need to chill. And what I want to encourage you is that while rest and stuff is a really, really good thing, that what I want to encourage you tonight is it's not just that you need to stop, but we need to take time to sharpen our axe, to use the analogy, to sharpen our axe. And so what we're going to do is we're going to talk tonight about how. And so if you think about, I brought an actual axe on stage because you guys know I love my props. So if you think about this, if you think about an actual axe, okay, if this axe has gotten dull, right, if it's no longer sharp, how are we going to sharpen this thing? Okay, you get a rock or some sort of like sharpening stone, and what do? You kind of like rub it up against it, right? And as you do that, you're creating something called friction. okay? You're creating friction. And friction is the resistance that occurs when one surface rubs up against each another thing, okay? Friction is that resistance. And what I want you to think about in your own spiritual life is like a challenge or friction, or what are things that are gonna stretch us or grow us in our faith? All right, so just some examples. Like the reason why we read scripture every day, right, is because every time we read it, it rubs up against my flesh. It's saying God has a way that he wants us to live, right? And it rubs against just plain old natural me. It's the same with like community or accountability, right? Every time you put yourself in community, even when you don't really feel like coming, right? What it's doing is it's rubbing up against just natural you that wants to hang out and chill and do whatever you want. And all of a sudden you're being honest in conversations. You're sharing things about God. You're learning and growing and things like this. Even disciplines as simple as like making your bed or something like that. Right? What it is it's this little thing that's creating friction in your life. It's a discipline, but that discipline is sharpening you. It's developing you. But that is tough for us because if we're honest, a lot of us just want to be comfortable, right? We just want to be comfortable. I've felt it even like I was telling you this week. I'm at a point, I just want to chill. I want to watch a movie. I want to kind of hang out like that, right? We just want to kind of numb out. We don't want things that feel like work. But one of the things that's been helpful for me in my life is to realize that things are hard, but you get to choose your hard. So for example, it's hard to sharpen an axe, right? It takes work, but it's also hard to chop trees when you're dull. And in your life, things like making a budget one day. Making a budget is hard, but being broke is also hard. So you get to choose your hard, right? Things like marriage and relationships and working all those things out, that's really hard. But going through failed marriages and divorce and things like that, also really hard. You get a chance to choose your hard. Maybe it's physical fitness, like getting in shape and stuff, it's really hard. Going to the gym, it's hard. But also being overweight and stuff like that and having sicknesses and things, really hard. You get a chance to choose your hard. And as a culture, we don't like friction, but as people of faith, it's something that we really need in our life. And at the core of what I think like friction is, to get a little bit more into it, is I think that it's actually often subtraction, okay? If you think about the guy with the axe, he had to stop, okay? He had to stop so that he could have time to sharpen his blade. He had to stop. And Jesus would call the process like of pruning us, right? Of removing things. It's subtraction. It's refining us. And I think what's wrong is a lot of times we often treat our relationship with God like addition, right? So we already have this really busy, full life, and we want to add a little bit of Jesus on top of it, right? But then when things are too busy and we're overwhelmed, well, we just start subtracting things, and often our relationship with him is kind of one of the first things to go. I think what God actually wants for us is, he talks about in a passage in Matthew 6, for example, he's like, you're worried about many things, but what I want you to worry about is this one thing, right? I want you to worry about seeking first my kingdom. In other words, subtract everything else and seek me. And sometimes that is a discipline. Joe was even in Psalm 63 this morning, and I was noticing when David was praying, he kept using this phrase, I will, okay? And I want to show you this verse. He says, my lips will glorify you because your faithful love is better than life. So I will bless you as long as you live. At your name, I will lift up my hands. You satisfy me as with rich food, and my mouth will praise you with joyful lips. If you notice several times in that passage, it says, I will. Some version of I will. My lips will. My mouth will. I will. Kind of thing like this. I think what it's getting across is that it's a discipline, all right? It's when I don't necessarily feel like it, right? I still will praise you. And that is something that God uses to develop us. All right. One more thing on this. As I was thinking about this, I think something that I realized is that for a lot of us, following Jesus is something that we value, but it's not necessarily something that we prioritize, right? Meaning that we care about it in our heads, but when it comes down to like our schedule and our week and what we do in our day and stuff like that, or how it's changing us literally, it's not something that we really put on the calendar. And I think that what I want to talk tonight is that the invitation today is to subtract the many things and to get back to that one thing, right? To get back to that one thing that really matters. All right, so practically, what is a way that we can get our edge back, to use that example? What's a way that we can get our edge back? The answer I would like to give you as one of those ways is prayer and fasting, okay? Prayer and fasting. Now, just out of show of hands real quick, don't be embarrassed. How many of you fasting is currently a part of your life? Okay, none of us, none of us. All right, so if you feel like weird about, you thought you were the only one, none of us really have this as a big part of our life right now. But I want to show you that in the New Testament, that this was something very, very common. And I think that it's something that's actually neglected by us to our own detriment. But I think that it can be extremely helpful in our walk with God. All right, so I'm going to read you a few passages. The first one is going to be in Luke 4, just verses 1 through 2. So this is Jesus as he's beginning his earthly ministry. And it says that before he does a single thing, before he heals a person, before he preaches a sermon, before he does anything like that, it says that he goes out into the wilderness for 40 days and he fasts. That's what he does. And if you know that story, you know that the devil comes and he tempts him in all sorts of ways. And people often talk about how Jesus was like extra weak during this time because he was hungry. But if you notice how Jesus responds, he's like kicking the devil around with Deuteronomy quotes the whole time. He's spiritually sharp. And I want to say that I think that part of that is because he has spent time connecting with God. He's spent time in prayer and in fasting. You see, as Jesus continues in his ministry in Luke 5, that Jesus continues with this practice of fasting. So he's gathering huge crowds. They're all coming to listen to him preach and do miracles and wonders. But Jesus wasn't too interested in like just hanging around the crowds all day. And so in Luke 5, we see this statement. It says, but Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and he prayed, right? He would get away and he would spend time with God. In Matthew 6, there's this statement, and Jesus is teaching how to pray and how to fast and do all these other things. And he just says this. He says, when you fast, which I love that. Most of us, right, we raise our hands. Most of us don't do it. Jesus just assumed we would. He said, when you fast, here's how I want you to do it. He says, don't be sad-faced like the hypocrites, for they make their faces unattractive, and so their fasting is obvious to people. But I assure you, they've got their reward. But when you fast, I want you to put oil on your head and wash your face so that you don't show your fasting to people, but to your Father who is in secret. And your Father who's in secret, he will reward you. So notice that twice in this verse it's saying that one, right, it's assuming that you're going to fast. It's something that Jesus expected or assumed that you would do. It's when you fast. But not only that, there's a reward attached to it. He's saying that when you do it, your Father who sees what you're doing in secret, that he will reward you. The last passage like this that I want to show you is in Matthew 17. But the disciples, they're at this moment where they meet a guy that has really bad seizures. And we'll just read this. We'll just read the story. It says in Matthew 17, Lord, this is the guy's father. He says, have mercy on my son because he has seizures and he suffers severely. And he often falls into the fire and into the water. And I brought him to your disciples, but they couldn't heal him, right? They were powerless to do anything about it. And Jesus replied, you unbelieving and rebellious generation, how long will I be with you? And how long must I put up with you? Bring him here to me. So Jesus doesn't like this. And then Jesus rebuked the demon and it came out of him. And from that moment on, the boy was healed. And then the disciples approached Jesus privately and they said, why couldn't we drive it out? And Jesus said in verse 20, because of your little faith, he told them. And for I assure you, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you will tell this mountain, move from here, and it will be moved, and nothing will be impossible for you. However, this kind does not come out except by prayer and by fasting. And so Jesus is telling them that there is certain power, there's spiritual power, there's clarity, there's wisdom, there's boldness. The book of Acts will tell us there's boldness that only comes in one way, and it comes from being with Jesus, right? And fasting and prayer and fasting is a way of accessing that. And so I want to just lay out real quickly, like, what is fasting? What is fasting? We're talking about it. What actually is it? So fasting, it is intentionally choosing, intentionally choosing to give up food so that you can grow in your hunger for God, right? You intentionally give up food so that you hunger for God. And here's how it eats. What happens when you don't eat? You get hungry, right? You get hungry. And this has been the biggest dilemma for me when it comes to my own fasting journey, okay? I always think that fasting is a wonderful idea when I hear a sermon about it, and then I decide to do it, and then it gets about lunchtime, and I hear my stomach start talking. And all of a sudden, I'm like, this was such a wonderful idea on Sunday, but it does not feel like a good idea on Wednesday afternoon, okay? What I want is pizza right now. What I want is carbs and stuff like this. And what happens is, when you don't eat, your body gets hungry. Okay? And remember how we talked about the friction, though? I think right there, that is the friction. That's the rub. This is saying, this is something that I don't really want to do right now, right? But in obedience, I'm going to do it, right? And so what you're doing, though, when you decide to fast and you actually follow through and do it, is it develops this thing where it says, God, it's not just the food that satisfies me. You're the one that satisfies me. Right? And just because I hear this like rumbling in my tummy, I don't have to obey my impulses in my stomach. I can actually obey you, right? Which is really important for your walk with God. Like if you think about it, for things that you don't really want to do, like maybe you don't really want to have boundaries, you're going to have to learn how to say yes to Jesus and no to your own selfish desires. Right? Maybe it's like sharing the gospel. Like you want to do it in your head, but you don't want to have an awkward conversation. And so if you're going to overcome that hurdle, you're going to have to learn to say yes to God, to be obedient to him, and to say no to the part of you that says, I'd rather just eat pizza right now, right? What it's doing is it's developing obedience in you. It's developing trust in you. But not only is it like a chance to rub off, some of that stuff, but it's also giving you a chance to connect with and hear from God. What we're doing is not just like skipping lunch, but working on our computer the whole time, okay? What we're doing is we're taking time to intentionally set aside a food for a moment, and while we're doing that, we're gonna take time to intentionally connect with God, to pray, to talk to him, maybe go on a walk, right? And what's gonna happen when you first do that is you're gonna feel so many different desires in you. You're gonna feel hungry, but then your mind's gonna be going crazy and you're gonna think about everything else, right, that you could be thinking about. And it's gonna feel like that was just a miserable waste of time experience, right? But what actually happens over time is you begin to be able to focus. You begin to be able to just listen to God, to just enjoy being with him and spending time with him. And for me, if I can tell you personally, besides just the fact that I like to eat and my stomach would get rumbling, the biggest obstacle I think I actually faced and still face with fasting is that I like things that are mental, okay? That are like in my mind is what I mean. I like ideas and thoughts and things like this. And if you think about it, most of us are taught to engage with Jesus or engage with God through our mind. Right? It's why we listen to sermons, we read books, we listen to podcasts, all these kind of things. Most of us are taught to engage with God through our mind. The reason fasting was so weird for me is because it was asking me to engage with God through my body. And I didn't really understand what that means. But what I would like to share with you is that just like in worship, the way we like posture ourselves in worship can actually help us worship. When we posture ourselves in like humility or in fasting and stuff, it can help us to engage with God. There's a verse in Romans 12:1, and it says that we should present our bodies, right, as living sacrifices. Not just our minds, but actually our bodies. John Piper has a quote, and he says that fasting is bringing our entire body into the discipleship process. But if we're honest, another thing is that fasting feels weird because it's asking us to do something natural, but expect the supernatural, and that feels weird. But let me just tell you, I want to close with these two stories tonight. There's two stories in 2 Kings that I just find to be really, really cool, and I think are helpful here. So we're just going to read through them real quick. The first one is in 2 Kings chapter 5. It's about this guy named Naaman, okay? And it says that Naaman, he was the commander of the army for the king of Aram, and he was a man important to his master and highly regarded because through him, the Lord had given victory to Aram. And this man was a valiant warrior, but he had a skin disease, okay? So basically an impressive guy, an important guy, a valiant warrior, but he's got a problem that he can't fix on his own. He's got a skin disease, right? And so he asked the king what he should do. And it says in verse 5 that the king of Aram said, "Go, and I will send a letter with you to the king of Israel. And he took with him 750 pounds of silver, 150 pounds of gold, and 10 sets of clothing. In other words, he was going to buy himself a miracle. He was going to buy himself a healing. And he says he brought the letter to the king of Israel, and it read, when this letter comes to you, note that I've sent it with my servant Naaman for you to cure him of his skin disease. All right? And in verse 7, it says, when the king of Israel read the letters, he tore his clothes, and he asked, am I God, killing and giving life, that this man expects me to cure a man of his skin disease? Recognize that he's only trying to pick a fight with me. So essentially, the king of Israel recognizes that this guy has a problem that he can't fix, and now he's asking me to fix it, and I can't fix it. I can't heal a guy of a skin disease, so he's thinking this whole thing must be a setup, right? So he's scared. But this is what it says in verse 8. It says, when Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, he sent a message to the king. And why have you torn your clothes? Have him come to me, and he will know that there is a prophet in Israel. So Naaman came with his horses and chariots, and he stood at the door of Elisha's house. So he came impressive, right? He came like a royal person on horses and chariots. And then it says in verse 10, then Elisha sent a messenger, all right? So Elisha doesn't even go out himself. Elisha just sends a messenger to him. And he tells him, go wash 7 times in the Jordan, and your skin will be restored, and you will be clean, right? But this is how Naaman responds in verse 11. It says, but Naaman got angry, and he left. And he said, I was telling myself, surely Elisha will come out, and he will stand, and he will call on the name of the Lord God, and he will wave his hand all over the place, and he will cure the skin disease. Besides, aren't Abana and Parphar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Couldn't I wash in them and be cleaned? And so he turned, and he left in a rage. And then it says this in verse 13. It says, but his servants, Naaman's servants, approached him, and he says, my father, if the prophet had told you to do some great thing, would you have not have done it? How much more should you do it when he only tells you to wash and to be clean? So Naaman went down, and he dipped himself in the Jordan seven times, according to the Lord's command. And then his skin was restored, and he became like the skin of a small boy, and he was clean. And then Naaman and his whole company went back to the man of God. They stood before him, and they declared, I know there's no God in the whole world except in Israel. I really like this story, and I feel like it illustrates a lot. But one of the things it illustrates is that Naaman wanted God to do the supernatural. He wanted a miracle, but he was unwilling to do the natural thing because it felt so simple to him, right? I want the man of God to wave his hands and touch me, and I'll be clean. But go and take a bath in the river? In the dirty water? Heck no, I'm not doing that, right? He wanted God to do the miracle, but he wasn't willing to do the natural thing. And I think that what fasting is, guys, is fasting is another example of God asking us to do the natural so that he can do the supernatural. The very last story, I'll do this really quickly, but the very last story is actually in 2 Kings 6, and there's a very similar thing. Some people are going out and they want to build some new houses. The land that they've gotten in is they need more houses and stuff like this. So they're going out to build some houses, and a guy's going out there with his axe, right? And he begins chopping some wood. He's chopping wood, right? And then it says in 2 Kings 6, let me read it. I've forgot to bring my page. It says, can you go to the next verse? All right, as one of them was cutting down a tree, the iron axe head fell into the water, and he cried out, oh, my master, it was borrowed. So he's chopping down the tree, and the axe head completely flies off, and it goes into the water. Most people think that it went into the Jordan River, okay, which is a murky river and a fast-moving river. So basically, this axe head was completely gone. But what I like about the guy's response is he doesn't just keep on pretending that he can keep on working, right? It would be silly to try to chop down trees with no axe head, right? But what he does is he admits his need. He says, I lost my axe, right? I lost my axe. And so this is what it says in the next verse. Oh, sorry, you can go to the next verse. It says, then the man of God asked, where did it fall? And when he showed him the place, the man of God cut out a piece of wood, he threw it there, and he made the iron float. And then he said, pick it up. And so he reached out, and he took it. I think what we also see in this story, right, is God asks us, just admit our need. You know, we talked about the idea of sharpening the axe. Some of us might need to sharpen the blade. Some of us might just be like, I feel like my walk with God has become completely disconnected, right? It's like there's not even anything there. It feels like it's lost. And what is so cool is that God can use, he can make axe heads float. He can make dead bones come to life again, and he can restore what was lost. And so I think what he's asking us to do is just admit our need, right? Admit our need, and then us to do the natural thing, like pray, like fast, like ask him for forgiveness and things like that, and then allow him to do the supernatural.